My name is Jules Marlowe. I am 32 years old, and I have spent 6 years building a life around the restaurant my grandfather left me on the edge of the cove, until the night I walked back into my own kitchen after closing and found my sister kneeling beside a stack of oil-soaked rags with a lighter in her hand. I had only come back for my keys. Ryan had gone home ahead of me 20 minutes earlier, and I told him I'd be right behind him. 20 minutes. That's the only reason I was standing in that doorway at all, and it's the only reason I caught her. "Morgan!" Her head snapped up. The lighter clattered against the tile. For a moment, neither of us moved, the two of us frozen in the blue wash of the walk-in's motion light. A red gas can tipped against the electrical panel. Rags stuffed exactly where an investigator would later say a fire could pass for faulty wiring instead of what it actually was. "It's not what it looks like," she said. I looked at the can. I looked at her hands, steady, not shaking, the hands of a woman who'd clearly done this math before. "Then what is it?" She didn't answer. She reached for her phone instead, unhurried, checking something. A message. A time. That was when I understood this wasn't an impulse. It was a plan, and I just walked into the one part of it nobody was supposed to see. "Who are you texting?" She looked up, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, my sister smiled at me the way she used to when we were girls, and she'd already won an argument before I realized we were having one. "You should have sold the restaurant when I asked," she said. "This would have been so much easier." I didn't call the police yet. I asked her the only question that mattered. "How long have you been planning this?" She didn't answer that either. Instead, she bent down, slowly, and picked the lighter back up off the floor. That was the moment I understood I might not walk out of that kitchen the same way I walked in. To understand how I got there, you have to go back 3 months, to the reading of my grandfather's will. Sam Marlowe opened the restaurant in 1989 with money he'd saved from 20 years of working other people's kitchens. Back when the cove was still mostly fishing boats and empty lots instead of the tourist stretch it's become since. I grew up standing on a milk crate beside his stove while other kids spent their summers at camp, learning how to tell when butter had browned by smell alone, learning that the ocean outside the window would forgive almost anything except a kitchen that stopped caring. He used to let me plate the desserts myself once I turned 12, standing close enough to correct my hand, but never actually taking the spoon from me. Morgan grew up in the same house and never once set foot behind that line unless someone made her. She wanted what the restaurant brought in, the comfortable house, the family name people around the cove still said with a certain respect. She never wanted the work that built any of it. And by the time we were teenagers, that difference had already calcified into something neither of us said out loud, but both of us understood perfectly. I was the one who stayed after school to help with inventory. She was the one who left the second she had somewhere else to be. When he died in February, the will left me sole owner, not a percentage. Mine, outright, along with a letter he'd written months earlier saying a business needs someone who tends it even when nobody's watching. And that in 30 years, he'd only ever seen one granddaughter do that without being asked. Morgan found me in the parking lot afterward, still in the black dress she'd worn to the reading, her jaw tight enough that I knew whatever she was holding back wasn't going to stay contained for long. "He didn't mean to leave me nothing," she said. "You know that isn't what he wanted. He left you the house upstate. That's not nothing. It's 1/3 of what that restaurant is worth, and you know it." Her voice hit the pitch it always got when she felt cornered. "I'm your sister. I should get something out of this, too." I offered her a job, a loan, anything reasonable. What I would not do was hand over half of something our grandfather had deliberately chosen not to give her. Something in her face closed like a door. "You'll regret this," she said, and got in her car. 2 days later, she called. Her voice softened into something almost pleading. "Jules, I've been thinking. What if I just came on as a partner, even a small percentage? I could handle the front of house, marketing, whatever you need. We could run it together, the way he would have wanted if he'd actually thought it through before he wrote that letter." "He did think it through, Morgan. That's the part you keep skipping." She went quiet on the other end for a moment. "You always did think you were the only one who loved him." "I never said that. I said I was the only one who showed up for him." She hung up without saying anything else, and I remember standing in my kitchen at home afterward, phone still in my hand, wondering if I'd been too hard on her, wondering if there was some version of generosity that could have made this easier without handing away something our grandfather had specifically protected. I don't wonder that anymore. I understand now that generosity was never going to satisfy her, because what she wanted wasn't a share of the business. It was the whole thing, and she was always going to find her way toward taking it rather than earning it. My husband Ryan never trusted her the way I wanted to. He'd married into this family 2 years before my grandfather died, and had spent enough holidays watching Morgan operate to have opinions he mostly kept to himself. "She's not going to let this go," he told me that night. "She's grieving. She'll cool off. I've watched your sister for 2 years. She doesn't cool off. She regroups." He was right within 6 weeks. First came the health inspection. 3 violations we'd never had before. An unscheduled visit triggered by an anonymous complaint specific enough. The inspector admitted that whoever called clearly knew their way around a commercial kitchen. Nobody outside my staff knew our kitchen that well. Nobody but Morgan. Then 2 suppliers we'd used for over a decade ended their contracts within the same week, citing restructuring. Ryan got one of them, a seafood distributor named Pete, who'd known my grandfather personally, to admit off the record that someone claiming to represent the restaurant's new ownership had called to say Marlowe's was being sold. New ownership. Nobody outside the family knew the will hadn't given Morgan anything. Nobody but Morgan had a reason to say it had. "This isn't grief," Ryan said. The cancellation letter spread across our kitchen table. "This is a strategy. Make the restaurant look like it's failing badly enough, and you either sell for less than it's worth or run yourself into the ground trying to fix it. Somebody's building a case that this place is a sinking ship. The question is, who benefits?" We didn't have to wonder long. A developer named Colt Whitaker, known around the region for buying up waterfront property at a discount and converting it into boutique hotels, started asking around town about whether Marlowe's was having some difficulties. He walked into the restaurant himself one slow Tuesday afternoon, uninvited, wearing a linen blazer that had clearly never been anywhere near saltwater, and settled into a seat at the bar like he already owned it. "I've heard the restaurant's been through a rough patch," he said, sliding a glossy card across the bar toward me. "Health code trouble, supplier issues. I'd hate to see a place with this kind of history go under. I'm prepared to make a very fair offer. Take the burden off your hands entirely." "The restaurant isn't for sale," I told him. "Everything's for sale at the right number, Miss Marlowe." He smiled the particular smile of a man who'd closed a lot of deals he shouldn't have. "No rush. Think about it." "I don't need to think about it." He left anyway, unbothered, the way people are when they already believe they know how a story ends. I threw the card in the trash the second the door closed behind him, and told myself that was the end of it, without understanding, yet how much of my own family had already agreed to help him make sure I eventually changed my mind. The next move was slower, and it took me longer to see it for what it was. Morgan started showing up at the restaurant during service, always with a reasonable excuse. Timing her visits for nights I was too buried in the kitchen to sit through her small talk myself, leaving Ryan to entertain her out of politeness. "She's trying to get to you through him," Dana warned me, a server who'd worked for my grandfather 15 years and known Morgan since she was a teenager stealing from the register. "I don't know what she's playing at, but she's playing at something." I watched it happen once myself, from across the dining room during a Friday rush, unable to leave the line to intervene. Morgan sat at the end of the bar in a dress that had nothing to do with a casual visit to her sister's restaurant, laughing too easily at something Ryan said, leaning in a fraction closer than the conversation required, touching his forearm once, briefly, in the exaggerated way people touch someone when they want a specific memory to exist in that person's mind later. Ryan, to his credit, kept a professional distance the whole time, the easy patience of a man being kind to his wife's grieving sister, completely unaware he was being filmed for an audience of one. I didn't want to hear Dana's warning. I found out exactly what Morgan was building 3 weeks later. Morgan called Ryan directly, not me, said she needed to talk about our grandfather, asked him to meet her for one drink 2 towns over where nobody from the Cove would recognize either of them. He told me before he went. That detail mattered more than anything else that happened that night. I only pieced together what actually occurred afterward, from Ryan's own account and later from a bar's security footage. He told me she ordered drinks before he even arrived, and that his came back stronger than he expected, though he didn't think much of it at the time. She spent the first 20 minutes doing exactly what she'd promised, talking about our grandfather, tearing up on cue at all the right moments, letting Ryan believe he was doing something kind for a grieving sister-in-law who had nobody else to talk to. Then, as the night wound down, she stood as if to gather her coat, angling herself so that when his hands came up out of simple reflex to steady the fabric slipping off her shoulder, she caught his wrist and pulled his hand downward against her chest. At the exact moment, a phone propped against a napkin holder on the table behind them caught the frame. Ryan pulled back so fast he knocked over his own chair, loud enough that 2 other tables turned to look. He told me later it felt like touching a live wire, an instinct faster than thought. But by then the photograph already existed, one blurred, badly lit frame that showed exactly what she needed it to show, and nothing at all about the half-second before it or the half-second after. She sent it to me the next morning. No message, just the image, landing while I pulled a tray of croissants from the oven. I dropped the tray. I don't remember deciding to. I called Ryan before I did anything else. He didn't hesitate, didn't stammer, didn't buy himself time. Your sister set me up, and I can prove it. I wanted to believe him instantly. I didn't. Not fully. Not yet. For 3 days I slept in the guest room, while Morgan called twice a day. Sympathetic, careful, telling me I deserved to know the truth about the man I'd married. It was Dana who finally moved me. You run a business on details, Jules. You catch a supplier shorting an order by counting boxes. Why aren't you using any of that on this? I zoomed into the photograph at 2 a.m. and noticed the chair pattern behind them. Dark green plaid, the exact bar Ryan had told me the name of before he ever left the house. I drove there the next day. The manager, once I explained what I actually needed, pulled 4 minutes of security footage from behind the bar. It showed everything exactly as Ryan described it. Morgan reaching for his hand, Morgan angling them both toward her own phone. His face, shock and then horror in the half-second before he stepped back. "I've got a daughter," the manager said, copying the file onto a drive for me. "If somebody ever did this to her, I'd want somebody to hand her the truth, too." I found Ryan in the garage that evening, sanding an old porch chair, the kind of useless task a person takes on while waiting to find out if their marriage survives the week. I played him 4 seconds of footage. He watched it once, then walked over and put both hands on either side of my face. I know how that photo looked. I know what 4 days of silence felt like, but I never reached for her. I have never once wanted anything from your sister except for her to leave us alone. "I know," I said, and finally, all the way down, I did. "I need you to hear one more thing," he said. "I told you exactly where I was going before I left the house. A guilty man doesn't do that. I didn't have anything to hide from you, Jules, which is exactly why your sister needed a photograph instead of the truth. The truth was never going to work in her favor." I sat down on the workbench beside him, tired in a way that went deeper than the 4 sleepless nights behind it. "I'm sorry it took me this long to trust that." "You didn't distrust me," he said. "You distrusted a photograph, and then you went and found the truth instead of just deciding to believe one version or the other. That's not the same thing as doubting me. That's just who you are. And it's the same reason this restaurant is still standing." We sat out there a long time that night, past midnight, not saying much else, just being in the same space again, without the strange, careful distance that had settled between us for 4 days. It didn't fix everything instantly. Trust doesn't work that way. But it was a start, and a start was more than I'd had that morning. We stopped treating Morgan's campaign as a string of coincidences and started building a case the way I ran a kitchen, one confirmed detail at a time. Ryan spent 2 nights combing through public county records and found a filing showing Whitaker's company had explored converting our stretch of the cove into a luxury development 3 months before our grandfather even died, meaning someone had told him about a vulnerable restaurant before it was vulnerable at all. He printed it out and set it on the table between us without a word, and I remember staring at the filing date for a long time, doing the math, realizing my sister had started laying groundwork to take this place from me, while our grandfather was still alive to hand it to me himself. Dana came back a few days later with something a bartender friend had overheard at a private club 2 towns over, the kind of place where deals get made over expensive scotch. Morgan and a man in a linen blazer, deep in conversation at a corner table, and one sentence clear enough over the noise to remember word for word. Once she's distracted by her marriage falling apart, she won't have the energy to fight the offer. I almost didn't tell you, Dana admitted, twisting her apron string in her hands. I didn't want it to be true either. I asked her to keep listening, quietly, without drawing attention to it, and for the next 2 weeks she did exactly that, picking up whatever small pieces of the town's gossip drifted her way. A delivery driver who'd overheard Whitaker on a call in his truck. A woman at the hardware store who mentioned Morgan had been asking pointed questions about our insurance policy months earlier, framed as innocent concern for her sister's business. None of it on its own proved anything. Together, it built a shape I couldn't unsee. The photograph had never been about Ryan. It was about buying time while the rest of the plan moved underneath it. A plan that apparently included Whitaker cutting Morgan in once the restaurant finally changed hands. We had the footage, the supplier cancellations, the anonymous complaint, the filing, and none of it stopped anything, because Morgan hadn't crossed a line dramatic enough yet for anyone outside the family to take seriously. She'd been patient, careful. We didn't know, that Tuesday night at our kitchen table, that she was already done being patient. 4 days later, Morgan told Ryan she wanted to stop by the restaurant after close to return a box of our grandfather's old recipe cards. A peace offering, she called it. She said she'd let herself in with an old staff key nobody had bothered to collect. Neither of us stopped to ask why she needed the restaurant empty. I left that night at 11:15, later than usual because a delivery had come in wrong. Ryan had gone home 20 minutes ahead of me. I was halfway down the coast road when I realized I'd left my keys in the office drawer, and I turned around without thinking twice. And that single unremarkable decision put me back in that kitchen doorway at 11:40, watching my sister kneel beside a gas can with a lighter in her hand. "You should have sold the restaurant when I asked," she said again. "This would have been so much easier." I didn't answer. I was already dialing, my hand steadier than I expected, and that steadiness seemed to unsettle her more than anything I could have said. "Don't," she said, standing, the lighter still in her hand. "If you call the police, this becomes real. Right now it's just a conversation between sisters." "You're standing in a kitchen full of gasoline, Morgan. It's already real." Headlights swept the front windows. I recognized the angle before the door even opened. And a moment later Ryan walked in, keys still in his hand, having driven back the second I called to say I was going back for mine. He stopped in the doorway exactly the way I had, taking in the gas can, the rags, his wife on one side of the room, and her sister on the other. Something settled over his face I had never seen there before. "Put the lighter down," he said. A second set of headlights slid in beside the first. Through the front windows, Colt Whitaker stepped out of a black sedan, adjusting his blazer with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed the hard part of the evening was already finished. He was supposed to wait outside, Morgan said, more to herself than to us. And in that one unguarded sentence, I finally understood the whole plan. She wasn't just going to burn the restaurant. Whitaker was going to be nearby to move on the damaged, insurance-strapped property before I even had time to grieve it, a fire that would have looked, to anyone without our knowledge, like nothing more than an old building and outdated wiring. Whitaker pushed through the front door, calling Morgan's name, and stopped cold when he saw Ryan and me standing there instead of an empty restaurant. "This isn't what we discussed," he said, already backing toward the door. "Don't move," Ryan said, and something in his voice actually stopped him. I finished dialing, gave the dispatcher our address, told her there was an attempted arson in progress with both parties still on the premises. The dispatcher's voice stayed calm and steady in my ear, asking me to confirm whether anyone was injured, whether the gas can had been opened, whether I could safely move away from it, and I found myself answering each question in the same flat, clinical voice I use when I'm walking a new server through a fire suppression drill. because some part of me had apparently decided panic was a luxury I couldn't afford yet. Morgan's face crumbled as the reality of what she'd started finally caught up with her. "Jules, please, you don't understand what it's like watching you get everything while I got nothing. Every single thing in this family went to you. The keys, the recipes, his trust. I was supposed to get something too." "You were supposed to earn it," I said. "The same way I did." "Easy for you to say. You never had to try." "He handed it to you. He handed me 17 years of closing shifts and burned hands, and every holiday spent behind that line instead of in front of it. You watched me do that work your whole life, and never once picked up a knife to help." My voice didn't rise. "I didn't want it to. I understand you tried to break my marriage before you tried to burn my business. I don't think you're the one who gets to explain anything to me right now." Whitaker had gone very still near the door, watching the two of us with the particular stillness of a man calculating exit routes. "Morgan," he said quietly, "we should go." "Nobody's going anywhere," Ryan said, not moving from the doorway, and for the first time all night, Whitaker's practiced composure finally slipped, just enough for me to see the fear underneath it. Sirens grew louder in the distance, cutting through the ordinary night sounds of the cove. My sister stood very still in the kitchen our grandfather built, holding a lighter she would never get to use, watching the life she'd tried to steal arrive to take everything from her instead. The next hours moved in a blur, flashing lights washing red and blue across the front windows, an officer named Sergeant Alvarez photographing the gas can exactly where it had been left, another walking the perimeter of the kitchen with a flashlight, noting the rags, the proximity to the panel, the specific placement that made this something other than an accident waiting to happen. Whitaker sat in the back of a patrol car with his hands cuffed in front of him instead of behind, already rehearsing, I imagined, whatever his lawyer would say by morning. Morgan didn't fight when they walked her out past the bar, past the tables where she'd once eaten birthday dinners as a kid. Something in her had gone quiet somewhere between the kitchen and the parking lot, the calculation finally used up, nothing left underneath it but a kind of hollow exhaustion. Sergeant Alvarez took my statement standing on the sidewalk, Ryan's arm around my shoulders, the neon sign still glowing pink and blue above us, untouched, saved by 20 minutes I'd almost talked myself out of going back for. She told me, once the scene had mostly cleared, that attempted arson with intent, layered on top of a documented pattern of harassment and business interference, wasn't the kind of thing that resolved itself with an apology at a family dinner. Whatever came next for Morgan would happen in rooms I didn't have to sit in myself, decided by people whose job it was to weigh evidence, not by anything I had to orchestrate. "You did the right thing calling it in immediately," she added, closing her notepad. "A lot of people freeze in that situation. You didn't." I didn't feel steady. I only remember functioning like I was. Whitaker's company cut him loose within a week. His name, once a fixture in the local business pages, started showing up instead in articles about what happened at Marlowe's. And two other waterfront owners he'd been quietly pressuring that same year suddenly found the nerve to say no. My parents took it hard, more grief for the daughter they'd lost to her own choices than anger at what she'd nearly done to the other one. My mother called 3 days later, crying in a way I hadn't heard since the funeral, asking the question every family asks when something like this happens. Where did we go wrong? "I don't know, Mom," I told her honestly. "I don't think there's one answer that makes this make sense." "She used to be so sweet," my mother said. "I keep trying to find the moment it changed." I didn't have that moment for her either. Some people carry resentment quietly their whole lives, and it never becomes more than a bitter edge to how they talk about their siblings at holidays. Something in Morgan turned hers into a plan, and I don't know exactly where that line got crossed, only that by the time I found her kneeling in my kitchen, she'd crossed it a long time before that night. I didn't visit Morgan before her hearing. Whatever conversation we still need to have, it isn't going to happen while she's calculating how much of the truth she can still bend in her favor. Ryan and I didn't need a dramatic reconciliation because the night itself had already done the work. We spent the weeks after doing ordinary things that felt extraordinary simply because we were doing them together and unafraid. rebuilding the supplier relationships Morgan had tried to sever one honest call at a time, having the walk-in's electrical panel rewired anyway, not because it needed it, but because I wanted to walk past that corner without flinching. The restaurant recovered faster than I expected. A short piece in the local paper about an attempted arson at a beloved family restaurant brought people through our doors who hadn't been in years, curious at first, then genuinely charmed all over again by a place that had clearly survived something and kept its doors open anyway. Pete from the seafood distributor came by himself the following week, ordering off the menu instead of just dropping a delivery, and told me over coffee that he'd never once doubted which sister was telling the truth. He just needed someone to finally say it out loud. An older regular named Mr. Castellano, who'd been coming in every Sunday for as long as I could remember, stopped me by the register one evening and asked if the rumors were true. When I told him the short version, he nodded slowly and said his own brother had tried something similar over their father's hardware store 30 years earlier, and that the wound from something like that never fully closes. It just stops being the first thing you think about every morning. I think about that conversation often. He wasn't wrong. The old bell my grandfather installed the week he opened Marlowe's still hangs above the front door. I used to hear it 100 times a day and barely register it. These days I notice it every time, a small reminder that the doors are still open, the kitchen is still mine, and the people who walk through chose to be there. The same way Ryan chose to drive back that night instead of waiting at home, the same way I chose to turn my car around for a set of forgotten keys. I think about that night sometimes. The gas can, the lighter, my sister's face in the blue light of the walk-in. I used to think family meant loyalty no matter what, the kind of bond that's supposed to survive anything simply because it's family. I don't believe that anymore, not in the unconditional way I used to. What I believe now is that the people worth calling family are the ones who show up when it costs them something, who choose truth over an easy story, even when the truth is harder to carry. Ryan and I renewed our vows quietly that spring, nothing large, just the two of us and Dana and a handful of staff on the back deck after close, the tide coming in under a string of lights he'd hung himself the night before. It wasn't about needing to prove anything to anyone. It was about marking, on our own terms, that we'd come through something together instead of apart. And that felt worth its own small ceremony. Morgan wanted the restaurant because she thought it represented everything she'd been denied. What she never understood is that the restaurant was never the real inheritance. The real inheritance was the eye my grandfather gave me for noticing when something has gone quietly wrong long before anyone else does. The patience to gather the truth instead of reacting to the first ugly picture someone hands you, and the courage to walk back into a room, even a dangerous one, instead of walking away from what's mine. The bell rings every morning when I unlock the door, same as it always has. Some mornings I still pause for a second before I step inside, not out of fear anymore, but out of something closer to gratitude for the 20 minutes I almost didn't have, for the husband who came back without being asked, and for a life that turned out to be worth fighting for after all.
Thank you so much for watching. Drop a comment below, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.